I think we all were hurt emotionally by the drought, and I think that one of the things it does is you question whether it's worth it. You know, you've worked all this time, and then you get wiped out. The thing that I see now that's the secondary effect is the people that were not able to hang on to their cattle or felt like they would just sell and rebuy, and now the cattle are so high they can't get back in.
Rain. A rancher's livelihood is predicated on it. Without it, grass withers and livestock suffer. When rain doesn't fall, many facets of the ecosystem are affected. But our ecosystem is durable and has survived several climatic calamities. And just like our ecosystem, ranchers are resilient. When it stops raining, ranchers must adjust. With time, the drought's chokehold slowly tightens its grip, forcing men and women to take more drastic measures with each passing month. Of all natural disasters, severe drought is the most stressful on a rancher because of its slow and unpredictable nature. Droughts take severe economic, social, and emotional tolls on cattle ranchers and their families.
But if you have cattle, you've got to have water and grass, and that's what it boils down to.
There's no substitute for Mother Nature in terms of growth, vegetative growth. Technology's great. Mother Nature always beats.
The first devastating drought to hit the modern ranching industry came in the 1930s. Known as the Dust Bowl, it parched Great Plains farmlands laid bare by ill-advised farming practices and turned daytime skies into near darkness.
It obliterated the country. When you came through San Juan was nothing but just waves and mounds of blown dirt, black dirt. And the San Juan area, the Logan area, this whole panhandle country, go into Texas and into Oklahoma.
At the same time, though, in the 1930s, there was so much destruction of the native vegetation all the way from North Dakota to Texas that we were kind of laying the ground open to these terrific dust storms that we had. And with the loss of the vegetation and the stronger winds that are associated with droughts, we dried up the soil moisture throughout that whole area much more than we've ever seen before.
Coupled with the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl dealt ranchers an environmental and economic catastrophe. Rangelands withered, livestock water evaporated, and cattle markets plummeted. President Roosevelt's New Deal policies for livestock producers were to depopulate animals that were weakened by the persistent dry weather.
After the paperwork was completed, the ones to be killed were herded into the large corral, cows and calves together. The stage was set. The government man went to his car and took out a pump .22 caliber rifle and lots of shells. He carefully loaded his gun, smoked his cigarette, and stepped into the corral as casually as if he were going for a walk. There were a dozen people watching, but the only sound was a cow bawling for her calf. Every eye was glued on the shooter. He was standing right below me, and I jumped when he chambered a shell into the gun. He raised the rifle. A sharp crack rang out. A cow crumpled and fell on her side, legs jerking. 3 seconds later, bang, another cow went down, and another, and another. Within a minute, 15 cows were dying before my eyes. I suddenly realized that I was in the wrong place. Hot water came up in my mouth, and I had an awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. But I couldn't leave. I was afraid I would be called a sissy if I let anyone know. This was a terrible thing for anyone to witness, especially for a 7-year-old child. That happened more than 70 years ago, and many times through the years, I have shut my eyes and vividly recall the sound of the shots, the bawling of the cattle, the fear in the eyes of the animals as they seemed to realize what was happening. But most of all, the shots ringing out, over and over and over.
The ranching industry was able to survive the harsh conditions and recapture its livelihood as agricultural practices improved. Then in the 1950s, another drought gripped the Great Plains. For 5 years, the region dealt with low rainfall and extremely high temperatures.
It's had a big effect on me personally, and I think it has on anybody that went through it. I know my granddad in the drought of the 50s, he shipped his cattle to Missouri. Then the drought just followed him to Missouri, and he finally had to liquidate them. And he basically went broke during the drought of the 50s and never did really recover from it. He never felt comfortable with it, and he always, if you got a good rain, he would always say, "That's just the way the last drought started. We had a big rain and then it quit."
Since the mid-1990s, years of good rainfall were followed by longer and harder dry spells. In 2010, cattle producers in Texas and the Southwest once again found themselves facing another serious drought. Called El Nino by meteorologists, cooling waters in the equatorial Pacific Ocean normally provide the Southwest with enough rainfall. His counterpart, La Nina, typically means drought for the region. Ranchers, jaded by Mother Nature's give-and-take weather patterns, feared the worst.
We got into the El Nino of 1997-98, and that El Nino became so strong that the low pressure in the Pacific approached the West Coast, cooled off all of the warm water that had been there ever since 1976, and bingo, we had ended that regime. After the El Nino of 2009-2010, we went into a very strong La Nina pattern. We saw some of the coldest sea surface temperatures on record from California to Baja towards Hawaii. That's exactly the territory that subtropical jet comes across to deliver moisture into the southern plains. With that massive cooling that took place, as we got into 2011 with this area already denuded from the drought, and then the super cold waters, the two came together, and that's why the drought really peaked in 2011.
The severity of the drought reared its ugly head that year and became known as the most severe one-year drought in Texas history. In a report by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 2011 and 2012 became the driest and hottest period that the Central Great Plains have ever experienced. Exceeding the harshness of the Dust Bowl, the drought of 2011 held haunting records in the agricultural industry that totaled over $12 billion.
In my opinion, this drought is not a 3-year drought that we so often hear about. This drought started in the southern Great Plains in 1996 and South Texas 1992. It just so happened that 2011 was the greatest impact year. 2002, 2004 were relatively wet years. 2010 was a relatively wet year.
The drought's intensity in 2011 forced cattle producers to take drastic measures. According to the National Climate Data Center, extraordinarily severe drought conditions gripped Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico from October 2010 through all of 2011. In Texas, statewide precipitation from September 2010 through August 2011 was the driest 12-month period since 1895. Desperation soon turned to panic for many ranchers.
I never knew it could be that bad. I'd heard all the stories, but I thought, well, the country was overstocked, or, you know, there was reasons why this happened that it won't happen again. And it happened. It was so severe that you can't really describe it if you weren't engaged in it.
The nation's brood cow herd, the economic engine of the beef industry, was devastated by the staggering heat and unprecedented dry spell.
The U.S. beef cow herd went from 32 million head in 2004 to 29 million head in 2014. So of that 3 million head drop, over half of it was in the state of Texas alone.
The economic health of the beef production infrastructure, marketing, finishing, transportation, and processing is dependent upon conditions of the industry's cow-calf sector.
Especially 2011 and the first part of 2012, we saw cattle numbers come into market and harvest plants running at peak capacities, over capacities, running 6 and 7 days a week. They'd never seen so many livestock available, particularly on the cull cow and bull side of the market. And a lot of these plants actually expanded capacity in 2011. Well, obviously, on the backside of that comes where we've been now for the last 12 to 18 months, and that being a dramatic shortage in livestock. And so we've seen record high meat prices, record high livestock prices.
In Texas in particular, in 2004, there was 5.5 million head of mama cows. Well, that number declined. By 2014, it was 3.9, so a drop of over 1.5 million head. Very dramatic. That's 30% drop in that 10-year period. The bulk of that drop occurred in 2011 and in 2012. In each of those 2 years of severe drought, there's 500,000 beef cows were taken out of the herd. So, you can see that 2/3 of that drop occurred right at the heart of the drought. We had pretty high cull cow values. Cull cow values are pretty stout, so what you had is incentive, so to speak, to go ahead and liquidate. Instead of buying that 250 ton hay to keep the cow going an extra year, you went ahead and cashed her out, or she moved to another state, another region where they had better feed resources. So from that standpoint, the market, even though it was stronger as a trend, really almost worked to disadvantage from a liquidation standpoint. It gave the cowman a incentive, so to speak, to go ahead and merchandise those cows. You take 30% of your cow herd out in a 10 years period, and you do 20%, of the total herd in 2 years alone. So that kind of migration or that kind of liquidation has very rarely occurred from a historical standpoint.
Ranch families who have invested years of blood, sweat, and tears watched the toils of their labor disappear when they were forced to ship hungry cattle to slaughter or to pastures where grazing was available.
But these cows just didn't like Wyoming. They just didn't adjust. They looked terrible. Our calves weighed good, and we sold them at a big auction. And then the next year, we were going to leave them there for 3 years. The second year they had a drought, and they told us, you've got to take your cows back.
It became a lot more than a financial consideration. It's like you have the welfare of all of these cattle is your responsibility. And when they'd come walking up to water and there was not a bite to eat and look at you, it was like, what are you going to do to take care of me?
We started out at 2,500 head of cows, and we're down to 1,000 plus this 200 head that we were able to save last fall.
As conditions spiraled out of control, rangeland health became a big concern. Overgrazed pastures impact hydrology, plant species survival, and wildlife habitat.
And I think coming out of this drought, we're going to see plants that have died. We're going to lose some species in some areas. And on shallow soils and in short grass country, I think we're going to see a real slow recovery. I think it's going to be a tougher drought to recover from than what we've experienced in the past.
And so there were people that just couldn't wrap their head around the fact that everything you do is dictated by Mother Nature and rainfall. And so since it didn't fit their business model, they just continued with their old business model. And I saw some really big ranges really hurt because of that kind of.
In August 2011, the Texas AgriLife Extension Service estimated Texas's direct agricultural losses from the year's drought at $5.2 billion. Livestock loss accounted for $2.6 billion, a devastating hit to the ranching economy. But it wasn't just ranchers and their families taking the brunt of the drought. Meat processing plants shut down, forcing thousands of men and women out of work. The largest facility to close was a plant owned by the privately held food company Cargill Incorporated. Located in Plainview, Texas, the plant's closing displaced 2,000 employees in a city of only 22,000.
Cargill made the decision to shut that plant down because it wasn't feasible for them to keep running it at reduced hours. They did everything in their power to try to keep that thing going for the city of Plainview and the Texas Panhandle. It was a losing battle for them just because A, the water, and B, mostly the head counts issue, not having enough to run efficiently.
Everyone knew things were difficult, and to see a company the size of Cargill shutter a facility of that magnitude that arguably was the sort of the lead dog of their roster of packing plants. It was really their focal point of their company, and in North America at least. It was one of their most modern plants. It was one of their largest plants, and everything about it. And it was almost, I would almost liken that to General Motors declaring bankruptcy. To see a company like Cargill close down, just walk away from a plant the size of that facility in Plainview that had a capacity of 4,000 to 5,000 head of fed cattle every single day. So 20,000 head a week capacity taken offline instantly, and literally hundreds of employees, probably close to 2,000 employees left looking for work.
If we talk about the non-fed or the cow plants, we've lost over the last 18 months about 4 packing plants there with about 6,000 to 7,000 head a day capacity. In the early 2000, 2003 time frame to 2013, 2014 time frame, we basically harvested about 3 million less cattle.
Packers were having to go further and further to locate livestock and pay more and more for them, added freight costs to them, and we definitely lost some long-time excellent packing companies. San Angelo lost a packing plant that was processing 500 to 800 head a day. San Antonio lost a major packer that was processing closer to 1,000 head of cull cows and bulls a day, and that is a major impact on ranchers, especially within a region, to have that amount of packing capacity for their cull animals to just disappear overnight.
A gut-wrenching aspect of drought is the uncertainty of recovery. Since the mid-1990s, ranchers have experienced wet years followed by intense dry years. Capital was spent and risks were taken that often proved to be futile. But ranchers adapt and change because of each drought. Some of those changes, made out of necessity, became common practice and may prove beneficial in the long run.
Risk management's another thing that we probably will pay more attention to, not only for the feed yard standpoint, which is extremely important, but working back into the stocker and the cow-calf side as well. With this kind of volatility, not only in cattle prices, but also in input prices, it just makes more sense that we're going to be more in tune to the market and be more conscious of our risk management program.
One of the challenges to being a young producer is you really don't know how to prepare because you've never lived it. Right. And you don't know, you hear what they say, but you don't know how you're going to adapt. And for me, you go to bed worrying about it, you wake up worrying about it, am I making the right decision, is it going to blow up in my face? So, again, that's a huge challenge for for a younger guy, and hopefully I stayed open-minded enough and obviously came out on the other side. I think the best thing a guy can do is, you know, call somebody who's been through it, you know, somebody who's a generation ahead or 2 generations ahead, and get a good idea of the impacts. But history always repeats itself, so there's a lot of things that we can learn from folks who have been there.
It has tempered my willingness to take on risk, which is probably good as you get older, or the risk-reward ratio begins to change, and you want to hold what you've got rather than try to go out and aggressively make more. So age and drought have made me more risk-averse than I used to be.
Through hard times, hard lessons are learned, and innovations are made, and I do think that when we come out the other side of this, the surviving industry is going to be better for it.
Even if a rancher is brave enough to give Mother Nature another try, the cost of re-entry is staggering. Cattle prices are at an all-time high, and uncertainty about markets makes many ranchers anxious about building new cow herds. The future of the industry remains uncertain.
It's just as important, I've found, it's just as important to have an objective restocking plan as it was to have an objective destocking plan. Because a lot of people, when it began to rain again, said, I'm going to wait for a little while, maybe these cows will get cheaper, and instead they got higher and higher, and the net result is that your cows that you sold for $700, you're now having to replace for $3,000.
The average producer, cow producer, and generally speaking, most surveys would say they're rather old. Do they want to get back into the business at that age? You know, for our younger producers, again, it's capital requirements really a limiting factor.
There's always something tough. If it was easy, everybody would do it. But I think we're in for a pretty good extended period of these kind of pretty high prices. I'm optimistic about it.
Optimism, something most ranchers must have to get through the inevitable dry years. And pride in the industry, the heritage, and the future. Optimism and pride will fuel the continuation of the industry and spur the development of new management techniques to hopefully make the next drought a little more bearable.
I tell you, you don't stay in this business unless you're an optimist. I mean, I think you'd lose your mind if you didn't have a positive attitude about it. And it's the only thing we know. Maybe it's stupidity, I don't know, but it's the only thing. I'm a 4th generation, and my grandkids are 6th generation, so it's one of those things. I really couldn't put a real finger on it.
It has helped me to have the next generation of my family be involved in it, because I like to see their enthusiasm, their the fact that they don't feel overwhelmed by what happened. They've still got plenty of youthful enthusiasm and positive attitude, and that's been good.